We're live.
All right. Hello out there. Thank you for joining us today. We appreciate your time. My name is Ed Walton. I'm CEO of STEP CG. We're a fast-growing IT solution provider here in Covington, Kentucky. I'm coming to you from our Innovation Bar Briefing Center, and this is where we innovate and we talk about new technologies. And today we got an exciting segment where we're going to combine talking about next generation security, zero trust networking, if you will, and the thought that everything is coming onto the network, but maybe we should authenticate first before we allow it on the network. So we got our friends from Elisity, and we also have Michelle Crowley and Katie here. Michelle's going to do an education, I think, on whiskeys and bourbon. Is that correct? Yeah. Absolutely. And I'm going to turn it over to Jesse and Dr. Pete Doolittle, who's going to talk to you about zero trust networking. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Appreciate it. And hello, team. Again, my name is Pete Doolittle. I lead go-to-market for Elisity, based here in Boston, Massachusetts. With me on the horn is Jesse, who is coming at us from Minnesota. He leads our deployment services and technical architecture teams. So before we dive in to zero trust, team, I think we should start off with our first tasting. And I know you're excited out of Covington to talk about a local holiday cheer known as New Riff. So take it away. Take it away.
Thanks, Pete. So the first thing we're going to try is New Riff, and all of you should have gotten a card in your box, and then there's a little bit about the whiskey that we sent you, and it's a bourbon whiskey. This one is from a local distillery. But before we start our tasting, I want to tell you a little bit about doing a bourbon tasting, and that is you have to first warm your palate up. So anytime that you do any kind of a bourbon tasting, it's really important that you make sure that you warm your palate, because when you first start drinking, if you just start drinking, then you're not going to really be able to taste the bourbon. So what happens is you're just going to taste any kind of bourbon is 40% alcohol. So what happens is when you take a drink, then you're just going to get kind of more of a bitter taste. So it's important to let your tongue warm up. So what you're going to do is, this is your bottle of New Riff. If you want to go ahead and open that, you can see our 3 bottles up here. So there's 3 ways that you can typically drink bourbon. One is on the rocks, one is straight, and one is as a mixer. So depending which way you like it, we're probably going to do either on the rocks or straight today. So the first thing you want to do is you want to warm your palate up. So we're going to start with our New Riff. You want to go ahead and pour a little bit of that into your glass, and you want to warm up your palate. So to do that, if you want to just pour a tiny bit, and you also want to go ahead and you want to kind of swirl your bourbon around just a little bit. And you want to breathe it in, kind of smell it, let it breathe for just a moment. And then when you put it in your mouth, you want to just let it sit there for a moment so that it can sit on your tongue, and you can just let it warm your tongue for a moment. And then you can go ahead and you can swallow it down. And it's really important to do that, because if you don't do that, if you just gulp it or if you sip it really fast, you're not going to be able to get any of the flavors of the bourbon. Instead, it's just going to go straight down and you're not going to be able to taste it. So the important thing is that you should feel kind of the warmth on your tongue, and you should feel the warmth in your throat, and you should be able to feel kind of the warmth in your belly. If you just gulp it right down, typically people talk about having that burn in their throat. And so when you have that burn in your throat, you know that you didn't get your palate warmed up ahead of time. So now all of you should have your palate warmed up, and you should be ready to go. So a true tasting means that you really get that taste. And like I said, you're going to kind of swirl it around, you're going to smell it, and you really want to taste it. So you're actually going to kind of chew the bourbon, you're going to swirl it, you're going to kind of let it sit in your mouth for just a second so you really get that taste. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to have a real taste of our new riff. And so if you want to have it on the rocks, typically you only put 1 or 2 ice cubes. If you have the big ice cubes, some people like to have those. And the reason for that is that you don't want your ice to melt to where you get so much water in your bourbon that it waters it down and you don't get the flavor. Personally, I'm a person, I like my bourbon cold, so I am a person that I do usually like to have at least a couple rocks in there. So I usually will put either 1, 2, or 3 little rocks in there, and then I'll pour my bourbon on top of that. Typically when you're pouring bourbon, you usually do either a finger or 2 fingers when you're pouring bourbon. It's not like a glass of beer, it's not like a glass of wine where you fill your glass up. That is not how you pour a glass of bourbon. If you're at a person's house, especially if they have a really nice bourbon or something that is more expensive, always only pour yourself 1 glass. Otherwise, it's kind of considered rude if you pour more than that. So once you pour it in, just kind of swirl it around once, it gets your bourbon nice and cold, and then you can go ahead and you can take a sip. So while you're taking a sip of your bourbon, you can look at your card, and while you're kind of holding that flavor in your mouth for a minute, I'm not going to read the card to you, but what I want you to do is just kind of see if you can taste some of the flavors that are in there. Some of the things that you really can feel or pull out in the flavors of the new riff is the butterscotch. And you can really taste some of those spices in there. And we're going to talk about in the next tasting a little bit about the mash and the whiskeys and the bourbons. But this one has some vanilla accents and some rye spices. And you should be able to kind of pull out. And when I taste new riff, I can always taste the dark berry, and I taste the cinnamon and the clove. But there is a mint in there, and there's some hints of vanilla and fresh oak. So that is our first tasting, and as you're drinking your first bourbon whiskey, hope you enjoy that, and we're back to Pete.
Well, what an amazing transition from local bourbon right into Zero Trust. It's just a smooth flow right there. So thank you, Michelle. We have an interesting concept to talk about. I mean, people say Zero Trust all the time, and what is it? What does that mean? To us, we're very hyper focused on this transition that's taking place in our market today. A number of things that are happening in the enterprise and how to secure the enterprise have changed dramatically. First, we used to sit in a world where there were most of the employees, 60-70%, living behind a firewall most days in the office. We then hit COVID and everybody went remote, and now we're back to kind of a hybrid world, what we're calling disparate users that are spending time and coming back onto campus, onto branches, etc. Second thing that's taken place is the explosion of devices, whether those are medical devices, whether those are IoT devices, whether those are managed devices or unmanaged devices. We're seeing tons of things connecting to the networks, some of which administrators know about, some of which they don't. And that visibility is a huge challenge for a number of different folks. And unfortunately, it's given the bad actors out there new attack vectors to come try to take advantage of the situation and look for ways to get access to applications that they certainly shouldn't. So Jesse, as you're kind of thinking through reasons customers have deployed us and looked at this solution and tested it and gone through the deployment process, I know there's a number of industries. These are just a couple of the ones that we work with on a regular basis: finance, healthcare, manufacturing, utilities, certainly retail, et cetera, but get kind of what are some of the things you're seeing and hearing from the customers?
Yeah, thanks, Pete. I think a lot of customers this looms in the back of their mind, right? Whether it's ransomware attacks that they're seeing in the news, or it is the requirements of new compliance and regulations that really start the conversation. But when we get in there and we start looking at what their networks, their users, their devices that they have in there, some they know about, some they don't. We'll talk about that in a little bit in like our POC process. But ultimately what they're seeing that Elisity can bring to them is a lot of visibility and enforcement for those users and the traffic flows. So microsegmentations for the users and devices, looking at more than just IP addresses or even port numbers, but like the applications, all the way up to layer 7, being able to limit where those users are going, or just seeing the visibility into what the platform provides them. So again, a lot of things are kind of starting the conversation, but where they're really seeing value is that visibility of all of those devices, and being able to, from a single platform, no matter where that user or that device lives within the enterprise, on-prem or not, is providing a single simplified policy for them.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that our customers are very excited about is the time to value here. When we walk out of even a one-day POC, Jesse, I think it's pretty impactful when the customer has the ability to see lots of things in their network that they didn't know were there, and secondly, really get a solid look at, here are some low-hanging fruit policies that we could do right away and impart right away, and deploy them across either users or, interestingly, contractors are a big deal, especially contractors that try to plug into ports. And finally, devices, and those devices such as Xboxes, media players, things that a lot of administrators don't want on the network, creating simple policies to either block or just allow, but internet only, and make that simple. And then, as this is a journey, Jesse, letting it soak, letting the system and the data come at the administrator and say, all right, we're starting to tune this a little more towards zero trust or away from zero trust, and allowing more or allowing less over time. But getting those low-hanging fruit policies out of the way, which we'll share with the team shortly, has been a big deal. So, thinking about a couple of customers that have jumped on the platform, this is a large global manufacturer, pharmaceutical company. They had a couple of challenges. One is they'd been involved in a NAC project with the largest networking vendor for over a couple of years, huge professional services outlay that just wasn't ever going to get out of POC. And they couldn't, even over these times, the requirements changed and things just got really long and stale. The second piece to this was there were over 36 different Active Directory instances that they needed to kind of pull together and at least be able to glean some information out of it and make it somewhat seamless across all the different platforms. So with that scale of devices and users across the platform, they needed something that was cloud managed. They needed something that was simple and create simple policies across all these different groups within the organization, to make it a lot more seamless for the team to manage and create and enforce policies on this one. This one had a pretty interesting use case as well. First of all, 4,000 employees in the organization, but 6,000 users in Active Directory, and admittedly, they're saying, hey, we need to do a project to some extent clean up Active Directory in some cases, and this is a perfect motion to help tie that in, because as you're restricting access to especially the contractors, having something that will create policies, simplify the process, et cetera, across the board. And then the second piece was the devices. This organization, has a very small IT staff, like most do today, and are dealing with the lean IT organization, but 5 hospitals, 56 clinics, 2 long-term care facilities, and 1 assisted living facility really, had limited visibility into the devices that were on the network, even in the core hospitals themselves, as they went through the POC processes and in production. The things they found on the network, things like, Jesse, media players and Xboxes in the kids area, the pediatric area that were just not supposed to be on there. POS machines that were supposed to be part of an outsourced organization were on the network, et cetera. Some Pelotons and other exercise machines that were plugged in directly into the network instead of, just all those types of things. So to be able to create policies that could simplify segmentation across the board there for these types of users and devices. And finally, even a mid-sized financial institution, they were stunned, Jesse, when they flew to the Georgia branch and found a Golden Tee IoT machine plugged directly into the network with users using it on a regular basis and potentially punching a hole into the organization. The other thing was phishing attacks, and then those users bringing those laptops back onto campus and plugging them directly in to the ports. A lot of different challenges across users and userless devices in all three of these use cases, and there's a myriad of others. Jesse, anything that kind of add on these couple of customers?
No, not a whole lot, but I think the main thing here is kind of going back to a wide variety of industries and different challenges, but it all leads back to the network, right? So we can't go out to every device and install software on every single device. We can't go out to all these unmanaged devices, and regardless of your industry or your size, like, people are facing the same challenges everywhere, and that's what we're trying to solve. So I think that's the main outtake from these very different yet similar customers and customer sizes that we're talking about here today.
Yep. And when you think about the architecture, that's a kind of a hot button for a number of customers. There's a number of customers that have different size type, small tiny branches with one user, to a kind of tier 3 site with a couple dozen, to a large branch retail store type of scenario, or a campus hospital manufacturing facility. There's a number of different places in network with different types of devices that are out there, Jesse. So how do you look at this when you're looking at a distributed enterprise in any of these industries, as you're going through this?
Yeah, so this is a good slide that just kind of depicts a really high level network, and thinking about all of the areas that, whether you're a business owner, you're in a certain business unit within a enterprise, or you're an IT admin or a help desk, like, you're supporting users and devices across the board, no matter where they live. So if you look at this diagram and just kind of start at the top where we have the Elisity Cloud Control Center, ultimately what that is that's the brains of the operation. So a ubiquitous policy control plane. So this is where the different network devices within the Elisity platform send the information, where we get the visibility, where it's a completely cloud delivered platform for our customers to log into, to see what's going on in their network, to see the users and start to build policy and monitor their deployment. So we show that as just wide across the board, whether that's on the left here, users and devices connecting. We talk about the data plane or secure connectivity layer, where we can enforce policy. We can start to glean that information and start to restrict and give the appropriate levels of permissions for those users and devices, all the way to the application layer, looking at whether that's on-prem, Office 365, whether it's your SaaS apps, a cloud environment like AWS, where we can apply controls in there and continuously update that information, or your own on-prem data center or applications that you're hosting within your environment. So just I'm not going to go into a ton of detail today on how we do this or where we deploy, but you can see here that if you look on the left, whether it's a branch office or remote workforce, we have the Elisity access servers that those locations or users can connect to, and where we can glean that information, control who has access and where they're going and what they should have access to. Now, those same users come in and plug into the environment, and we can, with containerization on a lot of the more modern switches, we can look at that information and apply policy right out at that access switch layer. So we can use the intelligence of the switch in the way that it can apply policy, and we can program it to what we need based on what we're seeing and what you're defining in the Elisity Cloud Control Center. Whether that's on-prem users, devices plugging in, like physically plugging in, or it's wireless. And all of that goes through the entire network to the campus, to cloud, using different IDPs and integrating with your different IDP policies. So it's really ubiquitous across the board here, Pete, on where we deploy and how we apply that policy, regardless of location or locations of your user or your data.
Right. And I think one of the things that our customers really appreciate is, when a change is made in Active Directory. So if in the case of a healthcare, if a student is promoted to doctor in Active Directory, then you don't have to create any more policy in our platform because it already recognizes that user now is part of the group called physician. So they now have access to XYZ applications on the right. Similarly, if an additional application is added to AWS and is grouped as part of some policy that we've already created in the platform, you don't have to recreate anything else. These users now have access to it because the policy's already been written. So it makes it much easier to administer this, and we'll see a couple of examples of that as we get to it. But before we do that, I think we should turn it back to the team, Jesse, and have our second tasting of the evening here. Michelle, Katie, back to you.
Great, thank you, Pete. Okay, so our next tasting is going to be actually one of my very favorites, and that is Woodford Reserve. And one of the things I want to talk a little bit about is the aging process. And age has a profound effect on bourbon. And so the aging process is how long it is in the barrels and basically what happens while it's in the barrels. So basically, when the aging process goes on, you have, it goes through the winters and the summers in the barrels, and there's basically kind of a little bourbon dance that goes on. And so it's where the bourbon interacts with the wood, and all of the distilleries will basically do some kind of seasoning of the wood. And so they'll char the wood, they'll put different kinds of seasoning on the stays that are in the wood, and that's what gives their bourbon the flavor. So the longer that the bourbon is in the barrels, the better and the richer the flavoring is in the bourbon that is created. Contrary to belief, people sometimes think that the bourbon will continue to age when it is in the bottle, and that is not the case. It does not continue to age in there. Something that does have an effect on it is if you have a bottle of bourbon, if you leave it somewhere that is very hot or you leave it in direct sunlight, that can actually degrade your bourbon. So you want to make sure that you always leave it in a cool place and that it does not, that you don't ever leave it anywhere where it will be in direct sunlight. So you have to be careful about that. Also, every single spirit is a little bit different. The taste can vary based on the different types of grains that are in there, and no bourbon is going to continue or is going to taste the same. No two different the different flavors, and that's because the way that they create their unique recipes. So the reason that I love Woodford is that it is actually made up of 200 different flavor notes that are in there. And so some of my favorite ones that are in there is oranges, cocoa, vanilla. It has citrus, toffee, caramel, chocolate. So a lot of things that are some of my favorite things. And so when you first try it, it has kind of a creamy taste, and then it has a warm, satisfying tail at the end. So let's go ahead and we'll do our second tasting. Again, as I told you, I do like mine on the rocks. So I'm going to put a couple of ice cubes in here, and I'm going to open up our Woodford. Pour a little bit of that in here. And swirl mine around a little bit so that I can get it nice and chilled. And then again, you want to get some more notes of it and smell it. And breathe it in. Remember that before you take a drink that you want it to sit in your mouth for just a moment so that it can warm your palate. And if you still have the taste of your other bourbon in your mouth before you take a drink, you do want to drink some water in between, because you want to make sure that your palate is completely cleansed before you drink in between. Otherwise, it will throw your taste off. If you still have any of the taste of the new riff in your mouth, then you're not going to get the full taste of the Woodford. So you always want to make sure you clean your palate in between each of your tastings. So make sure, do take a drink of water, swish that around, and drink a couple sips of water before you try your Woodford if you still have any taste of the new riff in your mouth. And then go ahead and cheers to all of you. And Pete, back to you. Thank you.
Michelle, I never thought you were going to be able to slip in a little Sound of Music reference there with the these are a few of my favorite things. Nice work there, Fraulein von Trapp. All right, well, let's get back to the program. You know, one of the things we wanted to showcase is sort of what do you find when you enter a POC or go live? Like what are some of the things that you find? So Jesse, I know you run POCs. You're running ragged with POCs right now, and then converting into deployments. What do you do in this process, and kind of what's it all about?
Yeah, so the POC starts with like the remote side of things. So what we'll do on the back end is turn up a cloud control center for you on the back end. Again, that's all cloud managed in AWS microservices architecture. So we'll get that going, and then we'll meet with you for roughly 4 hours remotely, where we'll go through and do some discovery and design, kind of find out what make sure that our goals are in line for this POC, that we're finding what you're looking for, and we're able to test what you want to see. And then we'll start looking at some of the integrations. So we'll connect to like if we're talking Azure AD or on-prem Active Directory, that we can start seeing your users, and you can start seeing how we integrate with your environments and how we can start pulling that data in to apply policy to it. So that's to set up an initial policy creation. Connecting to applications, if there's things in AWS that you want to test and control, we can do those integrations as well. And we'll do all that stuff remotely. And then kind of do some of those integrations and validations from what we can. So again, that's more of that's like the building blocks for the POC, but then we'll also do like the remote workforce types of users. So we'll set that up, make sure that, that we can get into the environment that we've connected to. If we're doing on-prem, that we can get to those networks, and then start looking at some of the policy. So the next part is when we would come on site. So this is where you're going to really see like that first part, you'll kind of see the building blocks for the Elisity platform and see how things are connected and how we have visibility into these different environments. But then really for the on-site piece, we'll want to deploy one of our appliances. So we call this an Elisity Edge. There are multiple ways that we integrate into your networks, but for a POC, we found that the Edge is the simplest and quickest way to insert into the network. So this is basically a 10 to 40 gig appliance, depending on where we want to deploy. Usually we'll work with you when we're kind of defining that criteria on where, if it's mainly focused on devices, where we're going to see a lot of devices. If it's medical devices, if it's IoT or industrial, kind of finding those closets and finding an uplink where it makes sense. And we'll install our device for like a 1 day on site. So we'll come in, we'll put that device in at a time that works for you. And then we'll let that thing churn for a while, and we'll start to get some visibility into what's going on with the network. So we've got it built out. Now we're seeing the traffic. Now we're seeing devices and users. We're seeing when they log into the network and what kind of activity you have going on. And from there, Pete, we'll sit down at the end of the POC and we'll go through and show you. And I think our next set of slides here, Pete, are kind of showing some of the things that we've found and some of the potential recommendations that we've made for our customers on some of that low-hanging fruit that you had mentioned early on in the call, on where they can start seeing some quick wins that really can provide value for them.
Yeah. And again, not to go too deep on the architecture, but you spent a little time on the Elisity Edge. Our customers are all over the place in terms of what their networks look like. Obviously, if you have a Catalyst 9000 as your access layer or other type of containerized area, and you've got test environments, you would probably prefer to deploy our POC on the micro edge directly, which is obviously we deploy as a container or part of the container from that perspective, which is an amazing way to go no hardware for a deployment like this. So we can do it either way, and I would say it's a pretty big shift. Most of our customers that have that type of a scenario, if they have said unit in a place where we can deploy in the network and in a test environment, whether that is a branch or a test environment or even in a part of the campus, they would prefer to deploy that way. So it can be either way, either or, and as we move through the process. But connecting and truly finding out, what are you looking for from a user, application, device, policy creation and enforcement is all part of the testing process. And as you said, Jesse, let's kind of look at what you find, because this is a kind of typical readout from a POC that leads us directly into kind of a full deployment. So this is one part of in this case, a healthcare wing, I think it was, that we did for this one. They found a number of different devices. Obviously, when we say snapshot in time, we just kind of captured a snapshot in time, but there was, in this case, 152 PCs, a bunch of cameras, phones, APs, printers, medical devices. And the part that really got the head of security and the CIO a little bit upset were these last two: POS systems and game consoles directly on the network. And they wanted to obviously learn more about what are those doing there and what was the purpose. So what you'll see, and this is just a screenshot from the Cloud Control Center, is a lot of different pieces of information about the devices. In this case, it's a medical device. It's got a MAC address. It was discovered by static. We have a number of different ways that we are gleaning data. Jesse, maybe you can talk a little bit about that in a second. There's a place in network where this particular device is. The vendor is ResMed. And of course, any of the policies can be built on any of these different elements. So it could be a policy that's built on all medical devices, or all ResMed devices, or all devices that are in this node ID, i.e. place in network, or this individual device. Could be any of those different combinations thereof that get a policy. But Jesse, you want to talk briefly about how things are getting discovered and what are the different elements that are taking place there?
Yeah. So obviously, the most common way is MAC address that you'll see a lot of whether it's a NAC provider or network, solution that is trying to glean information from it. Let's grab the MAC address. Let's grab the MAC OUI. We actually, when we look at the MAC address, we go deeper than that. But beyond just the MAC address, there's a lot of information in DHCP. Because our solution is all the way up to layer 7, we can also pull data out of the network streams. So it's looking at, a device might look like this, but now they're going to some other service out on the internet that, a printer might not go to, or it looks kind of fishy. Like, we can identify devices beyond just the initial network attributes. We can look at where they're going, what they're doing. We can look in HTTP headers. We can see that layer 7 visibility to continue to classify and reclassify devices as they go onto the network and maybe move throughout the network, or as their traffic patterns change. So again, you mentioned that dynamic ability. It's not just a device authenticates, it's on the network, and it has this permission for the rest of its session. We're constantly monitoring and updating these definitions and policies for the users and devices, and updating them in real time, and not waiting for the next authentication event to happen for us to reapply policy. Yeah, and one of the things people ask is, so how is this different in this case? What you just mentioned from NAC. One of the main things is we don't scan and possibly disrupt devices like medical devices or industrial devices. We're passive and just continue to glean information, so it's not going to disrupt obviously a mission critical device like one you're seeing here, et cetera.
Phones. This is an interesting one. You know, we see sites where people have cut over from. In this case, it was Avaya to Cisco. Could go the other way in a lot of cases, or any type of phone system. And in the case of this one, they had cut over to Cisco phones and found old phone systems still connected to the network that they didn't know about. So that was an interesting one. But again, you know, the policy can be created on a certain set of phones or the entire IP phone system throughout the entire organization. Printers are a big one. You know, printers should only have the functionality of printing, not scanning the network, not looking for people, not being able to see other devices. Just, you know, in this case, getting to HP software and printing. That should be really the function that it serves. And then, you know, of course, the unclassified and unauthorized IoT devices like this, Jesse, you walk away from pretty much all your POCs and full customer deployments with a number of these types of things that are found on the network, would you say?
Yeah, that's for sure. And as we look at these types of devices, you might think, well, what's the risk in this? You know, talking with one of these hospitals, it was very much of, I don't want, it's not just because I want to control my network. It's, I don't want people signing into their Apple ID accounts on these Apple TVs that are plugged in the network, and then a patient comes in behind them and does the same thing, and that's potentially a HIPAA violation, right? So there's a lot of reasons why our customers don't want these devices, not because they're paranoid or anything. It's, there's legitimate risk in having these and responsibility if they're doing it. So even if they want to allow it, they need to know what's going on, and we provide that type of visibility into the network.
Yeah.
And you can, one of the things I wanted to call out here real quick, Pete, is this one and the last one too. You can see this little discovered by field. So again, this is an example of, this might show, you know, DHCP or the flow. Like we have that deeper level in inspection that we could see that this was an Apple TV because of the flow data that was involved here. Sorry, I cut you off earlier.
Yeah, no, not at all. So, you know, now as you kind of turn the corner and you captured all this information, you start to create and showcase policies, Jesse.
Yeah, here's one. So again, as Pete mentioned, and we talked about in the POC process, we look at these devices, we capture this data, and again, most of the time this is within a day, and we'll come to the outbrief with, here's some of the things that we saw, here's some recommendations that we have, and then here's just some other examples that you can look at. So in this case, the customer had some auditors that were coming on site and just needed access to certain file shares. So one of the example policies that we looked at for them was like a contractor policy. So we matched on an AD group that was called auditors. And you can see that here, user equals AD group of auditors. Their destination was an EMC file server. So we captured that, pulled that data out, and knew it was an EMC file server. And what we said was in this example policy that you can only, based on the layer 7 protocol, you can only get to SMB, CIFS types of traffic and DNS potentially. You know, there's probably going to need to be a few other things that they get to here, but this was a really good example of showing now whoever's in this auditors group, whatever server is either dynamically classified as EMC, or if the customer wanted to statically classify something that way, as those devices come onto the network, we've locked them down starting at day one. So there's a variety of different levels of granularity that we can apply here, or we can be somewhat general. But we always want to look at, you know, what are some things that are important to our customers, and what are some quick wins that provide a lot of value to them day one.
Yeah, and the contractor, specifically in the contractor space, Jesse, I think the one of the main things is people are either struggling with too little access or too much access, right? It's either they give them access to the guest, but then they can't get on maybe the device that they're there to actually support because they're not on the network, or they give them network access, either wired or wireless. And unfortunately, wired is a huge challenge, as everyone knows, to plug into a port. And then they have way too much access as they get into that. So, you know, this is really kind of a common challenge that we're seeing across the board. The other one is the deactivated. I mean, I know, you know, as I worked for a company, a large networking company, and left 4 years ago, and I still have access to a couple of the box accounts that I really shouldn't and I don't use, but I still have access to them.
Yeah, this is the importance of tying things back to an identity provider and integrating with that identity provider when you're looking at creating your policies, right? So if we know a lot of our customers are doing that today, regardless of who that IDP is, but tying those things back and then using that in your policy. So if a user is terminated, or even if you're just suspending their account because they're going on FMLA for a while, you can deactivate that account and not necessarily delete it, but immediately that dynamic policy change happens and it restricts their access to the network on whatever you define that to be. Maybe they still will need to, if it's like an FMLA thing, that they need to come in and get to certain HR systems only, but they shouldn't have access to any of your confidential or production data. Or it's the offboarding of users as if they're terminated, to make sure that we still want to have access to their accounts if we need it, but they do not have access to our network resources anymore, and it's effective immediately. So being able to classify, apply the appropriate, whether that's complete restriction or just limiting those inactive users from the network, is a really common use case.
Yep. And I know most of your customers have location-based requirements, time-based requirements. So kind of walk through that if you don't mind.
Yeah. So again, as you said, like location can be whether that's on-prem or off-prem, and I think I'll show that one in just a moment. But really, this one's around time-based policies. This was an example that the registration or the front desk those users didn't need to be logging in at all hours of the day. So let's put a time-bound restriction on their policy, and if they don't match that policy, they don't have access to the network. So here you can see we're saying, based on the local time that user's logging in, they can get access to the resources that they need to, starting at 7:30 a.m. until I think 6:30. This is a really small, picture, so it's either 5:30 or 6:30 p.m. Monday through Friday. They can, in this case, it was like a registration. They can print out registration badges. They can get to the registration system, but that's really all that volunteer maybe needs access to. That's running that front desk. Again, appropriate level of permissions, kind of the who, what, when, where. Who are they? When are they connecting? What are they connecting from, and where are they connecting from, or where are they trying to go, and building your policies around that.
And again, on the location side, it's obvious, like you said, on or off campus, but I think it's also like where in network and some other twists. We've had customers that say, there's 40 or 50 people that play a dual role in the organization. So they're on this desktop doing this one role for Monday and Tuesday, and then Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, they move over to this different department and access this. So there's lots of different ways that location, time can come together, across the board, Jesse, and make that into obviously an important one. But as we move off of users and start thinking about devices, I know you already mentioned this, printers should really only be used for printing.
Yeah, I was just listening to a podcast last week where they talked about a new attack that, if you visit a website, your browser could be compromised and go out and look for printers and install and hijack a printer on the network, and then that printer can phone home and become like a beachhead on the network. So there's, we all think of printers or these IoT devices as dumb devices, but most of the people on this, in this call probably know better. So this is an example of applying a printer policy. What do you need to get access to on a printer? There's just really common things, printing protocols, and they probably don't need to get out to the internet, or if they do, it might be just for software updates. Again, layer 7 policies versus just traditional ports and protocols. That these devices, again, this is a printer example, but whatever device it may be, restricting the appropriate level of permission for what they need. And a new printer gets plugged in, it's recognized as an HP printer or a Samsung printer or whatever it is, that policy is applied from day one. There's nothing that a network admin needs to do to go out there and write an access list or reconfigure a network port for that device. It's there.
Yep. And finally, unmanaged devices. I mean, we've already talked about these too. So our customers are very straightforward with this. It's either no, deny, or in some cases, it's it does allow them to go on the internet and do basic internet-based functionality, but that's it. So, that's a kind of dealer's choice from an admin perspective on this one across the board.
Yeah. The only thing I wanted to add here, Pete, because we've kind of beat this one up a little bit with our talking, but as you think about how you're applying policy, it's identity-based policy. It's the user, and it's the devices and their identities, and it's not network-centric. So if we're doing this, one of the struggles that we've talked to and seen from people is that, well, what port are they plugging into? What VLAN is that port in? Is it in a guest VLAN, or are they connecting to the right SSID? This or that, and we take some of that struggle out of there, because it doesn't matter what VLAN they're coming into. We're applying that permission for that device and that device's traffic, and we're not applying permission based on a network-centric approach. It's a device identity and user identity approach, and applying policy that way, regardless of their IP address.
Right. Well, I know that this is some of the things that we find for our customers as we're moving from POC into a kind of production environment. The way we put together the pricing, Jesse, is really simple and straightforward. It's per user and per userless device per month, and then we put that into usually an enterprise license agreement that combines services from our partner, in this case STEP CG, who does an amazing job with us on the deployment end. We put the services, we put the licensing, and then if there's any hardware, hopefully it's a situation where we can deploy in a hardware-less manner on a micro edge scenario if the network allows it, and go from there. So we'd love to have further conversations one-on-one with the folks on this call, and just to sweeten the pot a bit. If you're interested in a demo, you can get a nice $50 card, and we would give you a $500 card if you would join us in a free proof of concept, as Jesse just laid out as to what that looks like. So we'd love to qualify you and see if it's a fit on both sides, and go from there. With that, Michelle, let's talk about the third tasting, and then we can kind of take any questions that may have come up throughout.
Great, thanks, Pete. So for our last tasting, we are going to try Whistle Pig, which is a fabulous whiskey, and this one is 100 proof, and this is a really good whiskey. So first of all, contrary to popular belief, any kind of bourbons, a lot of people think that if it is a bourbon, it has to come from Kentucky. Actually, 95% of bourbons do come from Kentucky, and that is because of the limestone that is in Kentucky. So in the riverbeds, the riverbeds that are made of limestone, that helps in the fermentation process. And it's the very idyllic with the pH balance that helps in the mash cooking and the fermentation process and the aging of the bourbon. And that's why most of bourbon is made in Kentucky. So in the mash process that is used in the classification, if something is whiskey, all of it is made up of 4 different grains. And those grains are corn, rye, barley, and wheat. If it is bourbon, it has to be at least 51% corn. And so if it's less than that, then it's considered whiskey. So there's 2 different types of bourbon, and that's rye or wheat. And so I told you that the Woodford was my favorite, and that is a wheat bourbon. So if it's wheat, it's going to be a little bit sweeter. And if it's rye, it's a little bit more, it's got a little bit of a more bitter taste. It's got more of those, the different flavors in it are more of the, they're not as sweet. It doesn't have that fruity taste, where the wheat has that fruitier taste to it. So on our Whistle Pig, if you look at your card, you'll see that it has the allspice, the anise, the oak, the caramel. It does still have the vanilla. So this one is a rye-based. You can see that this is a whiskey, so this one is not going to have at least 51% corn, and that is why it is a whiskey. So that's the difference between your whiskey and your bourbon. And so that basically is the only difference that makes up the difference of whiskey versus bourbon. And the proof of this one is 100%. The other two we had, the New Riff was also 100%. The Woodford was just right below that. I believe that one was in the 90s. It was 90.4 proof on that one. So if you want to go ahead and try your whistle pig, again, you can either do that one straight or on the rocks. So if you want to put a couple ice cubes in there, don't forget, if you have not cleaned your palate, make sure you take a glass of, drink a couple glasses of water, or just swish that out in your mouth. And if you want to go ahead and pour yourself a glass of the Whistle Pig, this one is a really nice bourbon, or I'm sorry, a whiskey. And this one, like I said, is very nice. I just tried this one about a year ago, and I have to say this one has kind of moved up to one of my top ones. I had not tried Whistle Pig until about a year ago, and I have to say that honestly, this is one of my top favorites now. It's a very smooth one, although I'm not a huge rye fan. This is one that, because it is so smooth, and the reason that it is such a smooth whiskey is because of the aging process. So although I'm not a huge rye fan, because it is aged for 10 years, that is what kind of takes that bite away from it. And that's what makes it that it is a little bit of a smoother whiskey. And if it was only aged for 4 to 5 years, then it would be have a bigger bite to it and be a little bit more bitter. So hopefully you enjoyed the Whistle Pig, and hopefully you've enjoyed all of our different tasters tonight, and you've enjoyed learning a little bit more about our whiskeys and bourbons. Back to you, Pete.
Great. I don't know if there's a mechanism for us to answer questions, or if there are any questions, but we left a little time here for questions. Otherwise, I don't know. I guess I'm asking you, Michelle, is that possible to get questions, or are there any questions in a panel or anything? We're just seeing you. We're not seeing anything else.
They can ask questions, and Katie is monitoring those on the side. So if they have any questions at all, they can just type it into the chat.
Got it.
We can go ahead and ask those, and you can answer those for them.
Yeah, and of course, again, per the offer we just put forth, we'd love to answer those questions live and walk you through a demo. And obviously, if you're interested and fit the kind of the proper profiles, and we fit the proper profiles with you, we'd love to do a POC with you and show you what the STEP and Elisity team can put together for you. So, Katie, do we have any questions on the panel?
We don't have any questions right now, so I think we can wrap it up.
All right. Well, thank you. We appreciate the time. We hope you enjoyed the whiskey and the brief overview. And again, love to engage and talk more. Thank you very much, and make it a great holiday for everybody out there.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
See ya.
That's a wrap.
And